She told me, "Don't touch." But every look she gave felt like temptation I couldn't resist. It started on an ordinary Saturday afternoon, the kind where sunlight filters lazily through the living room windows, painting golden streaks across the floor. I had come over to my friend's apartment without much thought, just a casual visit, a chance to catch up. But the moment I stepped inside, everything shifted. She was there, leaning against the kitchen counter, casually flipping through a magazine, yet somehow commanding the room with the quiet grace of someone entirely in control. She wasn't flashy, but there was a confidence in the way she carried herself, a calm, measured elegance that made me suddenly aware of every detail. The gentle curve of her neck as she glanced up, the way her hair caught the sunlight, the faint scent of perfume, soft, warm, familiar, hovering in the air. I caught myself staring longer than I intended, and in that brief second, I felt an unusual tug at my chest. Not lust, not exactly, but something warmer, more electric, curiosity, admiration, and a sudden awareness of how different she seemed from anyone I'd known. My friend laughed at something across the room, but I barely registered the words. All I could focus on was her subtle smile, that small, knowing curve of her lips, as though she already knew she had my attention. When she finally looked directly at me, our eyes met for the briefest heartbeat. There was something teasing there, not mockery, not arrogance, but a spark of recognition, a silent acknowledgement that we were aware of each other in a way the rest of the room wasn't. My stomach did that thing it always did when I sensed danger and attraction, the kind that comes from realizing you're walking a line you haven't been prepared to tread. We exchanged words eventually, polite and casual, but even in the simplest conversation, talking about a new coffee place my friend had discovered, laughing softly at a shared joke, there was a tension that hung in the space between us. A brush of her hand as she reached for a cup, an accidental touch on the counter that sent a fleeting warmth up my arm, a soft laugh that seemed meant for me alone, though I knew it wasn't. Each moment was subtle, almost invisible to anyone else, but to me, it felt deliberate and alive. By the time I left that afternoon, my mind was buzzing, not with anything I could define, exactly, but with a sense of something beginning, a connection that had sparked in silence and lingered in the spaces between words. I knew one thing clearly: this wasn't just my friend's sister. She was someone I would notice in a way I hadn't noticed anyone before. And I had a feeling, a quiet, almost frightening certainty, that the tension I felt in that room was only the beginning. As I walked home, I kept replaying the brief moments, the tilt of her head, the way her eyes seemed to linger a second too long, the understated confidence that made everything around her feel charged. I wasn't sure what it was yet, but one thing was certain: from the very first encounter, she had found a way to occupy a corner of my mind, quietly, insistently, and with a force I wasn't ready to resist. The next time I saw her, it felt different, heavier somehow, like the air itself had thickened with anticipation. We were at my friend's apartment again, though this time it was quieter, the afternoon sun softer through the curtains, the hum of the city outside a gentle backdrop. She moved through the space with the same effortless grace as before, but now there was something more, an awareness of me, and perhaps, I hoped, a curiosity that mirrored my own. We ended up in the kitchen, talking about nothing in particular, trying to sound casual. I was acutely aware of how she carried herself, the way she shifted her weight from one foot to the other, the faint gleam in her eyes when she smiled. There was a moment when her hand reached toward the counter, and mine followed instinctively, our fingers brushing just barely, not enough to touch properly, yet enough to send a spark racing along my arm. She noticed, too. I could see it in the quick flicker of her gaze, the slight stiffening of her posture, the almost imperceptible bite of her lower lip. "Don't touch," she said, voice light but firm, eyes meeting mine in a gaze that was both playful and warning. It was enough to make my chest tighten. And yet, almost immediately, a smile tugged at my lips. The words themselves carried a challenge, and for a moment, I felt like a kid daring to cross a line he knew he shouldn't. "Then don't tempt," I replied, letting the words linger in the space between us. Her reaction was instantaneous, a small, incredulous laugh that somehow felt both amused and slightly scandalized. She rolled her eyes, yet there was a warmth to her expression, a hint of acknowledgement that the tension was mutual. She stepped back slightly, as if to reclaim her personal space, but the air between us still shimmered with a subtle electricity. Every movement after that felt charged. When she reached for a glass, I handed it to her, and our hands touched briefly, a fleeting contact that was enough to make my heartbeat quicken. She noticed it too. Her gaze lingered for a second longer than it should have, and there it was again, the teasing spark, the unspoken acknowledgement that we both understood the rules, yet were silently testing them. Even as we laughed over some trivial joke my friend made, I couldn't help but notice the little ways she commanded my attention, the tilt of her head, the way her hair fell across her shoulder, the subtle scent of her perfume when she leaned in closer to speak. Each detail, small and seemingly inconsequential, felt amplified, magnified by the unspoken tension that hung like a thread between us. When I left that day, I replayed the encounter in my mind over and over. Her words echoed softly. "Don't touch." And mine, almost teasingly. "Then don't tempt." It wasn't just a playful exchange, it was a boundary, a challenge, and a promise all at once. I realized then that the slow burn had begun in earnest. Every glance, every accidental touch, every small brush of hands was going to matter more than either of us could have imagined. From that moment on, I understood that nothing about her, or about the way we would connect, was going to be straightforward. The game of restraint and desire had just begun, and I was already captivated, unable to resist the pull she had on me. After that playful friction, our interaction started to feel more deliberate, though either of us admitted it. It was as if the universe conspired to create moments where our paths crossed, small fragments of time that seemed ordinary to anyone else but electric to us. We found ourselves running errands together, walking side by side to a nearby cafe, or helping my friend move a few boxes around his apartment. Each mundane task carried a subtle tension, a quiet thrill that neither words nor gestures could fully explain. I became acutely aware of the warmth of her presence, the way her shoulder brushed mine when she reached for the same object, the faint sway of her hair against her neck, the soft rhythm of her footsteps beside mine. There were accidental touches that felt anything but accidental. A hand brushing against mine as she adjusted a stack of books, her fingertips grazing the back of my wrist when she leaned over to inspect something. Each time, a small spark ignited, a thrill that I had learned to recognize and treasure. She noticed, too, the way her eyes lingered for a fraction longer than socially necessary, the subtle shift of her posture, a quiet acknowledgement that the tension between us was alive and mutual. We laughed a lot, too. Small, unguarded laughter that made the world feel warmer, softer. I remember the first time she laughed so freely that her shoulder bumped mine, and I felt a shiver of awareness run down my spine. It wasn't just attraction, it was the intimacy that comes from being seen, from the quiet knowledge that someone notices the little things about you. Every glance, every shared joke, every subtle brush of fingers deepened that unspoken connection. Our conversations grew longer, richer, moving from trivialities to glimpses of our inner worlds. She would tell me about her favorite books or her go-to cafe in the city, and I would share small stories of my own life, details that felt unimportant to anyone else but significant in this growing bubble of connection. I began to notice her vulnerabilities hidden beneath her confident exterior, a fleeting doubt in her smile, a pause in her voice, a softness in her gaze that hinted at layers I was only beginning to understand. Sometimes, when the space between us became too charged to ignore, we would step back, deliberately maintaining distance. Yet even that felt intimate. The awareness of her, the magnetism that seemed to pull us together despite the restraint, was almost overwhelming. I could feel it in the warmth of her proximity, the subtle fragrance that lingered when she was near, the rhythm of her breathing in quiet moments. By the end of those shared afternoons, I realized that the attraction wasn't just physical. It was built on recognition, curiosity, and a growing emotional intimacy. I was learning the language of her subtle gestures, of fleeting touches and lingering glances, and each moment left me wanting more. As I walked home that day, I replayed the memories in my mind, the accidental brushes of our hands, the warmth of her presence beside me, the quiet understanding that this connection was building something fragile yet irresistible. I didn't need to touch her to feel it. Every moment, every shared glance, every subtle interaction was enough to make my pulse quicken and my mind whirl with the possibilities that lay ahead. It was a rainy evening when our connection shifted in a way I hadn't anticipated. We had gone to my friend's apartment after a long day, the windows fogged with condensation and the steady drizzle painting streaks of silver on the glass. The usual lightness of our interactions felt heavier that night, softer, like the air itself had been charged with anticipation and quiet honesty. We ended up in the living room, sitting on opposite ends of the couch, the space between us just wide enough to respect boundaries but close enough that every subtle movement mattered. She curled her legs beneath her, tucking her arms around her knees, her expression distant at first, almost guarded. I watched the way her fingers traced absent patterns on the fabric of the couch, the slight tilt of her head as if trying to measure my reaction. Then, softly, she began to speak, not about trivial things, not about the usual playful teasing, but about herself. About fears she rarely admitted, about moments where confidence faltered, about the quiet insecurities that lingered beneath her poised exterior. I listened intently, feeling the weight of her words settle between us. There was no judgment in my gaze, only attention, a desire to understand and be present. At one point, she glanced down, and I noticed a flicker of vulnerability in her eyes that made my chest tighten. My hand hovered near hers, not quite touching, as if to offer comfort without overstepping. The proximity alone was enough to create a new layer of intimacy, the electricity in unspoken gestures, the tenderness of shared space. She seemed to notice it too, because her eyes met mine briefly, acknowledging the subtle support, before looking away shyly. Her voice softened further, a mix of hesitation and relief, and I realized that this was the moment she had been holding back, the moment where trust and attraction intersected. Every word she spoke felt significant, every pause weighted with meaning. I could feel the warmth of her presence enveloping me, subtle but undeniable, and the faint scent of her perfume seemed almost to settle on my skin, imprinting itself as part of the memory of that evening. When she laughed softly at her own nervousness, brushing a strand of hair from her face, I noticed the pulse of emotion in her movements, the quiet rhythm of her heartbeat beneath her sleeve. It wasn't about desire, not yet, it was about recognition, about seeing someone truly and being seen in return. I felt a swell of protectiveness, admiration, and a budding, unspoken longing that had nothing to do with urgency and everything to do with connection. By the time she stood to leave, the room felt different, warmer, more intimate, the invisible tension between us now threaded with trust as much as attraction. I walked her to the door, our hands brushing accidentally as she reached for the handle, and that fleeting contact felt like a promise, a gentle acknowledgement of what we both wanted but were still learning to navigate. As she disappeared into the rainy night, I replayed our conversation, her words echoing in my mind. I realized that the slow burn wasn't just about longing or desire, it was about emotional depth, vulnerability, and trust. And in that fragile space, I felt closer to her than I ever had to anyone else. The real intimacy, I understood, wasn't in touch, it was in the careful recognition of each other's hearts. The tension between us had grown almost unbearable, a delicate thread pulled taut by every glance, every accidental brush, every shared laugh. That afternoon, we found ourselves in a confined space, her kitchen, small and warm, the hum of the refrigerator a soft undertone, the sunlight streaming through the window catching the dust motes like tiny stars. The world outside didn't exist, all that mattered was the quiet, unspoken magnetism between us. We were both aware of it immediately. I reached for a cutting board, and she reached from the other side. Our hands met, fingers brushing just enough to send a shiver along my arm. Her eyes flicked up to mine, a flash of acknowledgement passing between us, a silent, mutual recognition of the pull we both felt but refused to name. She shifted slightly, stepping back as if to reclaim space, and yet the air around us seemed heavier, charged with unspoken desire. We talked, but the words felt secondary to the closeness of our bodies, the rhythm of shared movement. When she leaned in to stir a pot, I caught the faint scent of her perfume, the warmth radiating from her side. Every subtle gesture became amplified, the tilt of her head, the way her hair brushed against her shoulder, the gentle pressure of her elbow against mine. It was a dance of restraint and longing, a quiet tension that neither of us dared to break. I could feel my pulse quicken every time our fingers accidentally grazed each other, every time her gaze lingered a moment too long. There was a thrilling danger in the way we maintained polite distance while being acutely aware of proximity. The thought of crossing that line made my heart pound, yet the restraint itself heightened the intimacy, making every fleeting touch and shared smile feel electric. There was a moment when she paused, hands resting on the counter, her eyes meeting mine with a mixture of amusement and something deeper, something raw, vulnerable, and unspoken. I wanted to close the distance, to let the magnetic pull between us finally manifest, but I didn't. Instead, I held the space, letting the tension speak for itself, aware that this slow burn attraction was far more intoxicating than anything hurried or impulsive. Even as we laughed over a trivial comment about a spilled ingredient, I noticed the way her shoulder brushed mine briefly, the warmth of her body so close I could feel it in my chest. My breathing felt uneven, each inhalation drawing in more of her presence, every exhalation a quiet acknowledgement of the desire simmering just beneath the surface. By the time we finished in the kitchen, the tension hadn't eased, it had grown, a quiet, simmering force that neither of us could ignore. Every glance over the shoulder, every accidental touch, every subtle shift in our positions was a reminder that what we felt wasn't fleeting. It was real, charged, and carefully restrained. As I left that day, the images of her lingered, the soft sway of her hair, the curve of her smile, the warmth of her presence. The forbidden pull had become undeniable, a force threading through every memory, every anticipation of the next encounter. I realized then that this was the essence of the slow burn, not the rush of fulfillment, but the exquisite tension, the delicious restraint that made every touch, every look, every shared moment feel more intense than anything I had ever experienced. It happened on an ordinary evening that somehow felt anything but ordinary. My friend had called us over to help with a small task, moving boxes into his storage room, but when we arrived, the apartment was quieter than usual. The sun had dipped low, sending amber light through the windows, and a gentle hush had fallen over the room. Even the mundane act of carrying a box felt layered with tension, a charged energy that had been building for weeks now. At some point, she had paused near the doorway, her expression softer, almost vulnerable, as if the walls we built around ourselves for restraint were finally thinning. I stood beside her, trying to focus on the task at hand, yet acutely aware of her presence, the warmth radiating from her, the faint scent of her perfume lingering just above the boxes, and the subtle rhythm of her breathing that somehow synced with my own. And then it happened. A small mishap. A box slipped from my hands, teetering dangerously before she caught it without thinking. Her hand brushed mine, firm yet gentle, steadying the object and me at the same time. For a heartbeat, the world narrowed to that contact, the warmth of her fingers against mine, the unexpected electricity that shot through my arm, the subtle pulse of her heartbeat beneath her palm. It was accidental yet intentional in a way either of us could ignore. We both froze, eyes locking in a quiet, suspended moment. Her cheeks flushed slightly, and I noticed the soft bite of her lip, a telltale sign of nervous anticipation. My chest tightened, awareness sharpening around every detail, the soft fabric of her sleeve against my skin, the warmth lingering even after her hand had released, the faint hum of tension that vibrated in the space between us. It wasn't just touch, it was acknowledgement, a bridge across the unspoken desires that had been building for weeks. She laughed softly, a nervous, melodic sound that somehow melted the tension just enough for me to speak. "You're heavier than you look." I joked lightly, but the words were secondary to the electricity of the moment. She rolled her eyes, smiling, yet there was a softness in her gaze that hadn't been there before. In that glance, I felt permission, a subtle, silent encouragement that we could finally explore the closeness we had been holding back. Later, as we moved to rearrange some boxes on the floor, I found myself kneeling beside her, our shoulders brushing as we worked in tandem. Every accidental touch, the brush of our arms, the graze of fingers reaching for the same object, felt magnified, tender, and deliberate all at once. Her laughter echoed in the room, a gentle counterpoint to the tension, and I realized that physical closeness could coexist with emotional intimacy. That touch could be safe, warm, and meaningful without crossing lines we weren't ready for. By the time we finished, the first meaningful touch had done its work. The air between us felt charged but safe, a quiet understanding settling in. We hadn't rushed, we hadn't forced anything, yet something fundamental had shifted. The slow burn had reached its emotional peak, desire acknowledged, intimacy shared, and a new layer of connection established. As she left that evening, the warmth of her hand lingered in my memory, the faint pulse of electricity in my veins reminding me that the slow burn journey wasn't about grand gestures. It was about small, meaningful touches, stolen moments, and the quiet thrill of two hearts moving toward each other with patience, respect, and a deep, undeniable connection. The weeks that followed our first meaningful touch felt like walking on the edge of something fragile and luminous. Every encounter carried weight, the quiet intensity of unspoken feelings, the subtle recognition of attraction, and the deepening emotional intimacy that had grown between us. By the time we met that evening, the tension had softened into something warm and familiar, a comforting hum beneath every glance, every word, every shared moment. It was a quiet night, the kind that encouraged closeness. We had gathered at my friend's apartment, but it felt different this time, not crowded, not casual, but intimate. Soft light spilled from the lamps, casting a gentle glow across the room. She sat near the window, her hair catching the light, her posture relaxed yet inherently elegant. I joined her on the couch, careful to maintain a respectful distance, yet aware that every inch between us carried meaning. We talked and laughed, easy now in the silence that once felt charged with restraint. Our hands brushed occasionally, light, deliberate, fleeting touches that sent a ripple of warmth through me each time. She noticed it too. I could see it in the small smiles she gave, the way her eyes lingered just a second longer than necessary. There was a rhythm to our closeness now, a comfortable intimacy that felt both new and inevitable. At one point, she leaned slightly toward me, a gentle tilt of her head, her shoulder brushing mine. The contact was subtle, almost imperceptible to anyone else, but I felt it in my chest, in the steady thrum of anticipation that ran beneath our conversation. I let my hand hover near hers for a moment, then slowly, naturally, our fingers intertwined. The connection was electric yet tender, a physical acknowledgement of the emotional bond that had grown between us. We shared quiet glances, lingering and loaded with meaning, each one a conversation without words. I noticed the softness in her expression, the warmth that radiated from her presence, and the unspoken gratitude for the restraint and respect that had allowed this connection to flourish. It wasn't just attraction, it was understanding, trust, and the beginning of something far deeper than either of us could have expected. Later, sitting together by the window, the world outside muted by the evening's calm, she rested her head lightly on my shoulder. It was a gesture both small and profound, the comfort of closeness without urgency, the gentle affirmation of mutual affection. I could feel the steady rhythm of her heartbeat, the warmth of her cheek against mine, and the subtle scent of her presence that seemed to settle into my skin. It was the perfect balance of intimacy and respect, the slow burn culmination of weeks of tension, play, and emotional discovery. As the night drew to a close, the unspoken understanding between us was clear. We had crossed the threshold from curiosity and restraint to mutual trust and affection. Every glance, every touch, every moment of laughter had built to this point. There was no rush, no dramatic declaration, just a quiet, profound satisfaction in knowing that we had arrived here together, ready to explore what could grow from this shared connection. Walking home later, I felt a warmth that wasn't just physical but deeply emotional, a certainty that the slow burn had reached a meaningful peak. We had discovered each other not through haste or force, but through patience, subtle touches, and the careful unfolding of hearts. And in that, I realized, lay the true beauty of what we shared, a bond built on understanding, respect, and the quiet power of a connection that neither of us would ever forget. 15.